Hello and welcome to today's LaRouche Organization Manhattan Project meeting for Saturday, June 11th. There'll be a conference that will be held by the Schiller Institute next week, June 18th and 19th, entitled "There Can Be No Peace Without the Bankruptcy Reorganization of the Dying Transatlantic Financial System." And this conference is intended to bring together international representatives to convene to propose the strategic, economic, scientific, and cultural approach to building right now a durable security and development architecture for the world. Now, the world is focused on Ukraine, focused on the issues of war, focused on inflation, focused on many symptoms of a much more deep systemic crisis that has been actually characteristic of the transatlantic sector since the period of the early 1970s. Lyndon LaRouche, the economist and statesman, spoke to this many, many times, and he wrote an extraordinary number of documents, programs, and policy perspectives during the period from the 1970s until now. He ran, of course, for president of the United States also 8 times in order to try to advocate those policies. Many of those policies were adopted by various governments in part at different times. But now we've reached a point where without the actual direct implementation of what LaRouche sometimes called his LaRouche 4 laws, there is not a real possibility that the world as a whole, or the transatlantic sector in particular, can survive much longer. Either war, famine, pestilence, or the disease of usury will basically consume this once great civilization of the transatlantic. What we're going to do is to begin today by playing a short segment from Lyndon LaRouche from 2013. And you won't have to stretch your imagination to think about this segment as though you're hearing it delivered fresh and live today.
We're in a situation now where, in point of fact, especially in the Americas and in the Europe and Africa, for example, mankind is in the greatest danger of virtual extinction of the species ever known to us in historical accounts. There may have been prehistorical periods which are legendary, shall we say, as opposed to historical. But never before, since those historical times, or prehistorical times, has mankind ever faced a danger to the human species as great as the world as a whole faces today. What the key to understanding this is to shock a number of you, especially those who are European by profession, as to what the situation is today. Everybody knows, I think, in Europe and beyond, that we have a great hyperinflationary financial crisis, and that populations are being starved and probably starved to death in great numbers in various parts of this part of the world. And they're doomed unless the solution to this problem is identified and understood. Mankind is on the verge of a quasi-extinction. This is not something down the line. This is something in the immediate future. It's a problem which must be identified now correctly. It's a problem which is not understood in most any part of Europe, is little understood in the United States, though in the United States we have a better understanding of it than anyone else does. This system is about to go into a collapse. Now, there's an intention behind this. The intention has been bespoken by the Queen of England, who considers herself the Empress of the world, and to a large degree she is. Europe, for example, Europe is nothing, Western and Central Europe are nothing but puppets of the British Empire. You don't have nation states anymore. You don't have sovereignty anymore. You have a system. And the system is run essentially from London. And if this system continues and is not defeated, the power of the British Empire over Europe, or most of Europe, most of Western and Central Europe, the power over the United States right now, means that the doom that is threatened seems to be almost inevitable. The hyperinflation, which has struck Europe and the United States simultaneously in particular, it's a doomsday sign. And the rate of production of necessities is falling, and is falling at an accelerating rate, and will continue to fall at an accelerating rate as long as this transatlantic system of power continues. And no one in Europe has a chance now of doing much about it, because they're all tied in so heavily to the so-called Euro system. The Euro system is a mass suicide system of the unwilling. That's what we face. Now, how do we deal with this? They have an argument. The argument is, we've got a money problem, and we've got to solve the money problem. We've got to be nice to money, even if it means being mean to people, even if it means killing them. And that is exactly what the policy is of the current President of the United States. He hasn't gotten it voted up yet, but that's his policy, that's his intention. His intention is genocide against the major part of the population of the people of the United States, as well of Europe. So unless we can solve this little mystery of what's the money game, then we're not going to solve the problem. So therefore, I think I come to that particular point. What is the problem? Why are Europeans so stupid as to put up with this? Why are European governments more stupid than the people, of course? Naturally, they're more stupid. That's how they got to be governments. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been allowed into government if they hadn't been stupid, malleable. But there's only one solution, and that solution is Glass-Steagall. But most people don't know what Glass-Steagall is. They think it's a new kind of adjustment system. No, Glass-Steagall is the fundamental law of the United States. Glass-Steagall is a name given to that law at a specific time in history. Now today we have reached a point where we do have a significant influence, far greater than anything we had before in terms of the United States. And the core of what we are proposing is Glass-Steagall. Simply, the Glass-Steagall policy, if applied, will save the United States. If Europeans wish to survive, they will do the same thing. They will take a carbon copy of Glass-Steagall and bring it into Europe immediately and eliminate any other variety of economic policy system. And that's what's needed. What people don't understand in all of this, and what Europeans don't understand, they don't understand what economy is all about. That is actual physical economy, human economy. And we can learn a lesson from the animal kingdom. Because the animal kingdom evolves. Evolution is the natural state of living processes. As far as we know, the general trend of all living processes is based on evolution. Evolution to higher energy flux density forms of existence. And every bit of progress in mankind's status has always been a result of the utilization of the recognition of this principle. Now, in the animal kingdom, the animals that aren't so efficient die. They go extinct. The same thing is true of nations. Nations that don't progress die. They go extinct. Europe is going extinct. The United States has also joined the self-extinction club under the past two presidents, under the banning of Glass-Steagall. And therefore, what's happening in Europe in not considering Glass-Steagall or not applying it, what's happening in the United States, even though we have a better knowledge of Glass-Steagall and we have much more support for Glass-Steagall, but even in Europe, independent Europe thinkers are thinking in terms of Glass-Steagall as an economic reform. Even many people in England, many people in England who are in the British system who are bankers, were saying we must go to Glass-Steagall. They knew, in fact, that it wouldn't, nothing else would work except Glass-Steagall. Without Glass-Steagall, right now, civilization is dead. It cannot survive.
Now, Lyndon LaRouche's presentation was very specific to that moment, but you've heard him here discuss something called Glass-Steagall, but he's discussing a principle, not merely a law. What we want to do today is to go directly first to Paul Gallagher of the economics desk of EIR. And what we're going to do is try to dissect something that happened to people. It was a sort of an accident that happened to people. It was called a presentation by Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan. We're going to do is show part of that accident and then have Paul do a sort of autopsy of the accident for us. So we're going to roll the video first, then Paul will do his diagnosis, and then we'll continue.
But it's different. The Fed has to meet this now with raising rates and QT. And the new part of this isn't the raising rates, it's the QT. The QT we've never had QE before like this. Therefore, we've never had QT like this. So you're looking at something they're going to be writing history books on for 50 years. What was QE? What worked? What didn't work? I think a lot of parts of QE backfired. I think the negative rates was probably a huge mistake for a whole bunch of different reasons I won't bore you with now. But they got to raise rates, and in my view, they have to do QT. They do not have a choice because there's so much liquidity in the system. They have to remove some of the liquidity to stop the speculation, to reduce home prices, stuff like that. And you've never been through QT. So all the major buyers, if you go back to 2010 and say, who are all the major buyers of treasuries? All that time, it was central banks, foreign exchange managers, banks who were topping up their liquidity profiles because we had to for regulations. All three, it won't happen the go round. Banks are topped up, foreign exchange managers are topped up, the central bank will be selling, not buying, and governments have much more fiscal deficit to finance. That's a huge change in the flow of funds around the world. I don't know what the effect of that is. I'm prepared for, I tell you, a minimum huge volatility. And the third thing is Ukraine. That you've not had a European land war since 1945. Okay, and the complexity of Ukraine is we don't know the outcome. I always make a list, if you predict the outcome, well, you couldn't predict the outcome of Vietnam, Korea, Afghanistan, Iraq, 10 other conflagrations. All wrong. Wars go bad. They go south, they have unintended consequences, and this happens to be roiling the commodity markets of the world. Wheat, oil, gas, and stuff like that, which in my view will continue. We're not taking the proper actions to protect Europe from what's going to happen in oil in the short run, and we're not taking the proper actions to protect you all what's going to happen to oil in the next 5 years, which means it almost has to go up the price. We're not investing enough money, to keep oil a number. And for all those who love climate change, if oil prices go to 175 or 150, which I kind of think is in the cards, to tell you the truth, not in the immediate run, but down the road, then CO2 won't go down, which is everyone predicts because people buy less oil and gas. It's going to go up because all those other countries out there, the poor countries who need oil and gas to feed and heat their citizens, will not buy oil and gas, they'll buy coal. That's what's going to happen. CO2 will go up, it won't come down. And we're not dealing with these challenges. So those three things, fiscally induced growth, QT, Ukraine war. Look, I'm an optimist. I said there's storm clouds, they're big storm clouds. It's a hurricane. Right now it's kind of sunny. Things are doing fine. Everyone thinks the Fed can handle this. That hurricane is right out there down the road coming our way. We just don't know if it's a minor one or Superstorm Sandy or Sandy or Andrew or something like that. And it's you better brace yourself. So JP Morgan's bracing ourselves, and we're going to be very conservative in our balance sheet on with all this capital uncertainty. We're going to have to take actions, and I kind of want to shed non-operating deposits again, which we can do in size, to protect ourselves so we can serve clients in bad times. And so that's the environment we're dealing with. And I think it's okay to hope that'll end up okay. I hope it. That's my Goldilocks. I hope. Who the hell knows?
If you just joined us, we're here at the Manhattan Town meeting, and we're talking about the next conference, which will be happening next week, done by the Schiller Institute, called "There Can Be No Peace Within the Bankruptcy Reorganization, Without the Bankruptcy Reorganization of the Dying Transatlantic Financial System." And we're about to have Paul Gallagher do an autopsy on the accident known as Jamie Dimon that we've just seen. So, Paul?
Okay, I'm unmuted. You can hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So that's quite a contrast. There you saw, right after Lyndon LaRouche and the Glass-Steagall principle, there you saw, at least in the United States political arena, probably the leading, in the recent 10, 15 years, the leading opponent of the Glass-Steagall principle and of the reenactment of the Glass-Steagall law was and has been Jamie Dimon, CEO of the largest U.S. bank, J.P. Morgan Chase. In fact, in the period immediately after that speech that LaRouche gave, the middle of the last decade, when we were fighting very hard in the Congress and in state legislators around the country for the Glass-Steagall principle and for the reinstatement of the law, Dimon was a very active, very public leader of the Wall Street banks in acting to make sure that Congress did not restore the Glass-Steagall principle. In fact, at one point in 2016, there was an exchange of letters between letters that I wrote to the Des Moines Register and letters that he wrote to the Des Moines Register, specifically on the issue of whether local people should be supporting the restoration of Glass-Steagall in the U.S. Congress. This is the opposite. Now, the first thing you probably notice is this was a very widely publicized little speech that Dimon made here. It was only a week ago. It got a great deal of publicity because of his phrase, a financial hurricane coming right at us. That part of it was very widely publicized. The first thing that should be clear from watching it is he's not talking about a financial hurricane coming at his bank. Not at all. He's talking about a financial hurricane coming at everyone else. The investors in the stock market, the holders of the 401k and pension plans, which have been invested in the stock market, the investors in the bond market, the government and other governments which have issued bonds, the value of which in this hurricane, he is sure are going to be going down dramatically. It's going to give them severe debt problems, those governments. But his view and the view of the other CEOs of the biggest banks are that their banks are going to be blissfully unaffected by all of this because they are prepared for it. They have what he sometimes called fortress balance sheets, which will be unaffected by this hurricane. So it's a hurricane that's going to hit all of you. It's not going to hit him or his bank. And it epitomizes the position that these banks believe that they occupy. And in fact, as long as the American people allow it, they do occupy as being above not only the public, but above the sovereign government of the United States, and in a position where no one will blame them for any financial hurricane that hits the country, any deep recession or depression collapse that hits the country. They, of all others, will not be blamed and held to account and broken up as a result. That's his attitude. But then one should also notice that his view is that it is the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve alone which is in a position to take action to deal with this financial collapse oncoming, and that the Federal Reserve has to do something that he calls QT. That is the reverse of money printing. It has to pull now large amounts of money out of the system. And he makes two little admissions in the course of that 3 minutes there. The first is, he says, well, there's got to be QT by the Federal Reserve because they've got to take some of all this liquidity which has been put around, and all of the speculation has got to be cut down, which is going on as a result of all that liquidity. Well, therefore, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase is admitting right there that the whole purpose of the money printing by the Federal Reserve since the 2008 crash, and especially in the last 2 years, the purpose of that has been to put vast amounts of additional liquidity into his bank and the other big banks in the system in order to allow them to do what? He said it, to speculate, to buy and sell securities, derivatives, to throw that new cash into speculation, and that's what they've been doing with it. Then he says, near the end of that little segment, we, meaning his bank, we're going to have to shed some non-operating deposits. Now, there you could say, well, my goodness, this is getting obscure to the point of it's beyond inside baseball. No, who could possibly tell what non-operating deposits are? Well, I'm going to show you what they are and what the Glass-Steagall Act will do to them. These are the deposits and the loans in the U.S. banking system as a whole, going back to a point in the end of 1997 and coming up to a point at the end of last year, 2021. This is data from a report that the Federal Reserve publishes every week and has published every week for roughly the last 30 years. And this is very obvious. In this point, which I chose, December 1997, and I might say at just about every point previous to this in the entire history of the United States banking system, deposits in the banks and loans by the banks were just about equal. 10 years later, December 2007, deposits in the banks and loans in the banks were just about equal. Then, starting after the crash of 2008, with the QE that Jamie Dimon was talking about there, which he now says is going to be reversed into quantitative tapering, starting after that crash, the Federal Reserve started printing money and pumping it into the biggest of the banks, which now completely dominate the entire banking system by 75 or 80%. So by December of 2016, 9 years after this previous chart, all of a sudden, loans, deposits were about 40% more in the banking system than loans, something which had never happened before. Then we go just 5 years later to December 2021, and we have this astonishing situation where deposits in the banking system, less than 60% of the deposits in the banking system are used as in loans. And some 7 trillion of deposits have been pumped into those big banks by the Federal Reserve, which are being used for what? For pure speculation. He admitted it. They're being used for speculation in derivatives, speculation in U.S. Treasury securities, speculation in mortgage bank securities, in stock index securities, in every form of speculation that they have been able to come up with. That's where that Federal Reserve money printing has gone. And there it is, as plain as the nose on your face. So how do you remedy that situation where you have banks which are huge, which are so pumped full of liquidity they couldn't possibly fail? How do you, and yet are also unable to loan or unwilling to loan? Look at how little the loans in the entire banking system grew in that 5-year period from December 16 to December 21. Look how by what large an amount the deposits in the same banking system, the big banks, grew in that same 5-year period of time, courtesy of the Federal Reserve's printing of money. What do you do in order to make banks again into creators of credit and lenders of loans? You break them up. You use the Glass-Steagall principle and a restored Glass-Steagall Act in order to break up the banks and bankrupt all of those speculative units of those banks, which are using that $7 trillion worth of federal printed money, using it for speculation. You bankrupt all of that, and you leave there the commercial banking units, which have to loan money in order to remain in business. And this was done in the first creation of commercial banks under the First Bank of the United States, under Alexander Hamilton's Treasury Secretaryship in the 1790s. This principle was applied to the commercial banks. There were very few of them then in the United States. It was done again in 1864 in Abraham Lincoln's administration. The Banking Reform Act just called the Banking Act of 1864, again said that commercial banks could not engage themselves in security speculation, broker-dealer activities, and so on. It was done again in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt's administration, with what we know as the Glass-Steagall Act of the 20th century, lasted for 60 years. And that principle is the one, as LaRouche identified, that has to be restored to solve this ongoing collapse now. So that's what I want to introduce what Harley's going to go through in a way. That's what I want to leave you with.
Thank you very much, Paul. And for those of you, again, who've just joined us, Paul is with the economics desk of EIR. He may not be able to stay for the rest of the broadcast today, but if you have questions, you can certainly forward them to us, and we're going to scroll where you can send questions for today. Now what we're going to do is to go to Harley Schlanger, who's often here. He's a spokesman for TLO, and he's going to pick up. Harley's just written an article which actually addresses elements of these problems. And so, Harley, welcome. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Paul, for that review of the importance of the Glass-Steagall Act, which is one of LaRouche's 4 laws. I'm going to begin with something a little different, which is what I think is the most important development that occurred in the last week. And that was the successful filing of petitions to place Diane Sayre on the ballot in New York State as a candidate on the LaRouche independent line against Chuck Schumer, the criminal senator from New York. Now, why is this so important? Well, if you look around the world right now, what you'll see is there's a growing resistance against the unipolar world, which is being imposed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and NATO. And when I say imposed, I mean the idea of the unipolar world is there's only one power, and that's the power of the so-called Anglo-Americans, and they have the right to dictate to the rest of the world what should be done. This is what Anton Blinken calls the rules-based order. The idea that countries must adopt to the rules that are favorable to the unipolar order, or they'll be punished. And what we're seeing now is a global resistance to this. It's occurring everywhere. in the, well, not exactly everywhere, as we'll see in a moment, but the idea that you must give up your sovereignty in order to be acceptable to the powers that run the unipolar world is being rejected. Now, the reaction is against being forced on the one side to support the US, UK, NATO against Russia. That is, countries are refusing to go along with the sanctions policy. Secondly, opposition to the dual policies of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, which require the surrender of sovereignty to international or supranational institutions that are supposedly ruling in the interests of all of humanity, but in fact are narrowly ruling in favor of the corporate cartels that are behind the rules-based order. So this broad opposition has come primarily as a reassertion of anti-colonialism. The major center for this is the Global South, nations that previously were colonies, many of which were involved in the 50s and 60s in what was known as the non-aligned movement. And we're seeing somewhat of a resurrection of that today. Just give you a couple of examples. From India, there's enormous pressure on India coming from the US State Department, the US intelligence community, and from people like Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and the British. And what they're saying is, you've got to take sides. Well, there was a very powerful statement issued this last week from India by the External Affairs Minister, Jai Shankar, who said, no, we don't have to take sides. We're not sitting on a fence, we're sitting on our own ground. And he gave an eloquent defense of the idea that India does not have to choose to be in one bloc or another. That's not a solution. That as much as they want the war to end, they're not in favor of the sanctions policy coming from the United States. We saw this happen when Biden took his trip to Asia, and many of the ASEAN nations refused to give a full endorsement to Biden. Biden was presenting a so-called prosperity policy, but there was no policy. There was no agreement, as countries were essentially being rounded up to join a crusade to contain China. And most of the ASEAN nations did not go along with that. We see it from Africa, where many of the African nations at the United Nations refused to support the sanctions against Russia. And we saw, interestingly enough, the president of the African Union, Macky Sall, who is the president of Senegal, went to Sochi in Russia to meet with Putin and came out of the meeting, and he was there to talk to Putin about the problem of hunger. And the question that's being thrown out, or the argument that's being thrown out from the transatlantic countries, that Russia is behind the food shortages worldwide. President Sall came out from that meeting saying he got a very good explanation from Putin, a satisfactory explanation, and he thinks Russia is working to do something to alleviate the hunger. And he said it would help if the West lifted the sanctions against Russia. Again, the opposition to this war policy coming from the transatlantic countries. And then again, very poignantly in Los Angeles, the last few days at the so-called Summit of the Americas, where Biden and the unfortunate Kamala Harris were trying to present their proposal for a partnership for prosperity with the Central American and South American countries. Nearly half of the leaders of these countries did not show up, and they made explicit comments as to why not. But interestingly enough, Harris has been sent to Central America to discuss getting at the so-called root causes of the immigration to the United States and the poverty in those countries. And she talks about climate change and things of that sort. Never does she mention the lending policies of the Western banks and the International Monetary Fund. Never does she mention the anti-development policies that are preventing those countries from developing. And interestingly, the three countries that she was focused on, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, did not even attend. The heads of states did not attend. Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the president of Mexico, did not attend and attacked the United States for exclusionary policies, for keeping out Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. And the president of Venezuela, Maduro, was doing a tour. He was in Turkey, he was in Algeria, several other countries, and he spoke about the end of an era and the example of the boomerang effect of the U.S. sanctions policies hitting Western countries. So from Asia, from Africa, from Central and South America, we're seeing growing resistance. And let me just add one other aspect to the South American question. This week is the 40th anniversary of the defeat of Argentina in what the British call the victory of the Falklands Islands. This is when Argentina tried to reclaim sovereignty of the islands off the coast of Argentina. And Maggie Thatcher sent an armada over 8,000 miles to wage a war to reclaim those islands. This was denounced at the time by much of the world, and it was just denounced this last couple of days by the president of Argentina, who said it's disgusting that the British continue to keep this as a colonial reminder of the colonial times. So this opposition, as I mentioned, is coming from former colonial countries and countries that know what it means to be under the threat of credit cutoff, of trade policies, and so on from the Western former colonial powers. Now, there's also discussion going on of the alternatives to the dollar system. This is going on in the Eurasian Economic Council. It's going on between the Saudis and the Chinese, between the Indians and the Russians. It's going on everywhere because the dollar system is shaken, as you heard Jamie Dimon say, without really, actually you heard Paul explaining it, that it's a system which is extremely weak right now that's being smashed by inflation and the collapse of production. What are the complaints? Well, the International Monetary Fund conditionalities are anti-development. They're Malthusian. The green policies tell countries they're not allowed to use efficient energy sources such as coal, hydrocarbons, or nuclear to produce electricity. They must go to so-called sustainable systems, which Putin, in an address this week, made the obvious point, do not produce enough electricity cheaply enough to allow for development. So there is a move underway toward a new financial and strategic architecture. So why is the SARE campaign so important? Well, who's speaking up for this in the United States? You have voices from all over the global South. We have the recently military leaders and retired military in Italy, in France, even in Germany, talking about the foolishness of continuing this war in Ukraine. Where is that voice in the United States? And this is where the Schiller Institute comes in, but this is also where the SARE campaign comes in. There are people who are joining with us in the United States. Colonel Richard Black, many of you have probably seen his video, which has somewhere over 800,000 views right now. Ray McGovern, a prominent anti-war activist. In a sense, you have Colonel Black, who's a Republican conservative, Ray McGovern, who I don't think is in a particular party, but it would be considered by most to be on the left, and yet they share a common agreement, which is the war that's being conducted, supposedly on behalf of freedom for the people of Ukraine, is a disaster and threatens to move out of control into possible nuclear war. And for what reason? Who benefits from this? Certainly not the people who can't afford to buy a tank full of gasoline or pay for a doctor or pay rent. The benefits for these are going to the corporate cartels. $60 billion in arms voted up by the Congress in the last months Where's that going? It's not all being delivered in weapons to Ukraine, which, by the way, are being destroyed by Russian artillery. Who knows where it's going? When Senator Rand Paul tried to find out, his amendment was voted down. Now, the problem in the United States is, to the extent there's a peace movement, it doesn't have a full perspective to understand why this is happening. In other words, the economic causes of the war, and doesn't have a solution for it other than stop fighting. And then the America First, the MAGA supporters, many of them are against the war, but they're against U.S. involvement with other countries. Well, that's completely mistaken right now. What Lyndon LaRouche pointed out when he developed his four powers concept is that in order to defeat the power of the corporate financial cartels, the insurance cartels, the overall corporate cartels, you need a power beyond that of one nation. The corporate cartels function as a global institution, a supranational institution, whether it's the World Trade Organization or the IMF. Their power is to usurp the power of sovereign nations and to impose regulations from the top. To defeat them, you need a coalition of powerful enough nations functioning as sovereign nations on behalf of the interests of their people, working together. And now what you see from what I just presented, we're seeing that occurring throughout the global South. We see that with Russia and China and India in particular, three of the four nations Lyndon LaRouche identified in his four-power agreement. What's the fourth nation? The United States. And the irony here is that this is the tradition of the American Revolution, not as an isolationist nation, but as one which is spreading Republican institutions to sovereign nation states through collaboration, which is what happened after the American Civil War, when Europe moved to the American system, economic development and banking, in tariffs, in trade, and became powerful nations enough to threaten the British Empire. This is where we are today. We're seeing now a coalition emerging, a movement emerging of nations that could meet to establish a new security architecture and a new financial architecture. Where is the United States in this? Let me conclude by just making this point. The LaRouche Four Laws, the economic laws, the restoration of Glass-Steagall, a national credit system, a heavy investment in developing new platforms of infrastructure with an emphasis on advances in science and technology, particularly with nuclear fusion and space exploration. Those four laws come out of the American system idea of economics that LaRouche championed throughout his life. This is now becoming the policy direction of much of the world. What's needed is the American voice in this. That's why Diane Sayre's campaign and also Joel DeJean in Houston represent important potentials for the American people to rally behind. What's clear is that people don't agree with Joe Biden when he says fighting inflation is his most important objective. He may think that's what he's doing, but the program he presented last week is not going to fight inflation. The first thing he said is he's got to make sure we stay out of the way of the Federal Reserve. Let the Federal Reserve lead this fight. Well, the Federal Reserve is at least largely, not partly, but largely responsible for the hyperinflation with its quantitative easing policy, which it adopted on behalf of big banks such as JP Morgan Chase. Biden also said we're making progress in a number of areas, and the three areas he identified, savings, income, and feeling comfortable, financially comfortable, he was wrong on all three. This was fake news. The savings rate is dropping. The wages are declining in real terms because of the inflation. And some polls show between 75 and 80% of the American people identifying inflation as the biggest problem and saying that the nation is going in the wrong direction. So the American people are not happy with these policies. And if they really understood what was behind this US, UK, NATO effort to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia, that it was an attempt to prevent Russia from joining a movement to break out of this corrupt, bankrupt financial system, I think most Americans would be inclined to support that. So that's why we need voices in American politics, on the street corners of America, in the classrooms, on the radios and televisions, talking to the American people about this mobilization, this potential globally to build a new financial and strategic architecture. And Diane Sayre will be the voice of that, one of the most important voices for that in the United States. And she'll be addressing our conference next Saturday. So I would encourage people to register for the Schiller Institute conference, not just to watch it, but to organize for it, to become a part of it, and to bring the United States back to its tradition as a leading nation in support of sovereign economic development. This is what our tradition is. We now have much of the world moving in this direction. Our leadership in this is crucial, but it's not going to come from Biden. It's not going to come from the Republicans or the Democrats in the Congress. If you look at the people who are running with the intention to turn it over to the Republicans, very few of them have an inkling of what we've been discussing here. That's why we need a population which has the mental pitchforks to poke them in the rear end, to get them, whoever's going to be in the next Congress, to bring the United States back to its traditions and to join with the rest of the world to bring us to this new paradigm.
Okay, thank you, Harley. And if you've just joined us, we're here discussing this sort of a pre-meeting to the June 18th, 19th Schiller Institute conference. There can be no peace without the bankruptcy reorganization of the dying transatlantic financial system. And just to connect the two presentations, if you were with us at the beginning, well, actually three, from Lyndon LaRouche, Paul Gallagher, and Harley, to what we are going to be discussing in a moment with Diane Sayre. The idea of self-government expressed in the 1776 American Declaration of Independence was generalized to the whole world by Helga Zepp LaRouche back in 1984 when she formed the Schiller Institute. She actually drafted a document called the Declaration of the Inalienable Rights of Man. It was essentially the Declaration of Independence amplified and shifted a bit so that it could apply to all countries. That's kind of important to know because the actual foe that we're fighting is not a national foe. Nobody who's trying to fight on the national level is going to win against this. We keep bringing up British intelligence. We bring up the issue of the manipulation of what is a proxy war in Ukraine. But people are not very familiar with how this process has existed over the years. Back in 1987, the Executive Intelligence Review wrote a document called Project Democracy, the parallel government behind the Iran-Contra affair. And that Project Democracy apparatus identified back now 35 years ago, of course, has been the basis or the catalyst for many of the so-called revolutions, color revolutions in particular, that have happened in the last particularly 10 to 15 years. What we're going to do is, before we actually go to Diane, who's with us, we want to just indicate the way that this kind of an operation functions. And we're going to visit with, for a moment, something called the Oslo Freedom Forum. What you want to know about this is it's described by the London Economist as the Davos for human rights. And what we're going to see is the way in which the, if you will, the political shock troops are organized that make up or comprise the so-called democratic revolutions that you hear about all the time but never know the nature of.
Badge.
There is your name tag. Thank you so much.
Program of events.
So this is all the information for the week.
The revolution will be organised. From all over the world, the aristocracy of activists gathered in Oslo to tell their stories, share ideas and learn. They're already actors in their own countries, together today on a different platform. But there's work to do. The Oslo Freedom Forum isn't secret, but certainly obscure. In the basement of this 4-star hotel, human rights activists come to what feels a bit like a school for revolution. This workshop, how to make sure your message, whether in Egypt, Ukraine, Hong Kong, China, North Korea, catches on.
This may not evoke the spirit of the barricades, but the teaching here is to be successful, to topple a government for good. You have to be organised and to plan meticulously. And activists here have been involved in helping to organise the current protests in Hong Kong. Their plan to put thousands of people on the streets of the territory was in fact hatched nearly 2 years ago.
We've been told many of Hong Kong's demonstrators were trained long before taking to the streets to use non-violent action, as they describe it, as a weapon of mass destruction.
Protesters were taught how to behave during a protest, so how to keep ranks, how to speak to police, how to manage their own movement, how to use marshals within their movement. So these are people who are specially trained. There's also, how to behave when arrested. Practical things like the need for food and water. That movement can last longer when people are taken care of, and also how to manage a water cannon being used against you, and other types of police violence.
It's meticulous.
Absolutely.
It's the Oslo Freedom Forum is funded by the Freedom Fund, and the Freedom Fund is funded by the United States Department of State and the United Kingdom Home Office. This is not our idea of free and considered leadership, and it's certainly not sovereign. This is what makes up the armies in Ukraine or the armies of the color revolutions and so on. But that's not what was done in New York in the process by which the next speaker got herself on the ballot. And I think she's here to tell us not only about that, but sort of what the process is of real work for real causes without the benefit of governments and counterinsurgency agencies working on your behalf. And so Diane is, I think, driving at the moment or coming back. And so we're not going to have her with us here with a live image, but she's on the phone line, I believe, with us. Diane, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're very clear. Go right ahead.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Yeah, well, actually, what I wanted to discuss, which I think is related, because what the petitioning process began to do, as some of the volunteers even explicitly stated, is to restore the relationship between the people, we the people, and our representative government. And it was particularly miraculous in that sense because the establishment powers that be had wanted to prevent any non-establishment, non-major party candidate from being able to have access to the ballot by making this outrageous requirement of 45,000 signatures of valid, duly registered voters collected in a period of a mere 6 weeks, which we accomplished, and it was a very, very conscious group effort with the question of poetry interspersed throughout in our evening debriefings, and people really searching subjectively to be able to become effective enough to get the rates of signatures that were required in such a short time. Now, that is very important because we really are on the cusp of losing the republic and losing civilization. And if the United States does not remember the reason why we had a revolution against the British Empire in the first place, then the whole world is going to be in jeopardy. And I keep having this image. Well, I'll get to that. Our Declaration of Independence does not say life, liberty, and property. It says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is beautiful and is in keeping because all three of these are conceptions that are not exactly in the physical domain. Life, in a sense, is physical, but as of yet, there is no one who is able to define it or to generate life from non-life. But everyone knows that there is a difference between these two things. Liberty, again, is not something that you can buy or sell or weigh, or it's a universal principle. And as is the pursuit of happiness, not physical pleasure. But the thing that really gives one lasting happiness, knowing that our particular lifetime is not infinite, but there are ends to our physical life here on earth, but we would hope that in that short period that we're actually walking around in a human body, we're able to make a contribution that is part of the immortality of mankind, immortality of the species, a scientific discovery, a great poem, a great composition, raising children who are good people who contribute to mankind, or maybe a great-great-grandchild. Maybe that's the contribution. But it's something that extends our life. Now, this is very important in terms of not only Glass-Steagall, but really how to think about being sure you don't get ensnared. And I keep having this image in mind of the Malaysian monkey trap, which is, if anyone doesn't know what a Malaysian monkey trap is, it's a cage which has a large nut in it. It can even be a walnut or something like that. And the monkey has to stick its little hand in through between the wires of the cage or the bars of the cage. And if it grabs onto this nut, its fist is too large. Its fist is too large to be able to pull its hand out again. And so that if it insists on clinging to this object, it will be there, it will be trapped, and it'll be turned into soup. This reminds me of what we often used to get from people, particularly in some of the labor unions with very decent pension plans, when we would talk about Glass-Steagall, because we would say the markets are going to have to take a hit in this. And they would say, well, what about my pension? What about my stock market investments? I'm going to lose all these things. Well, guess what? If you have hyperinflation and you're paying a wheelbarrow full of money for a loaf of bread, as happened in the Weimar Republic, your money isn't going to be worth anything. You may have millions of dollars in your pension fund, and that will be enough to buy you a one-way subway token. So that people get obsessed with clinging to a thing, an object, which has actually no intrinsic value, and you lose everything. So our Constitution was designed with a higher principle in mind, a principle of immortality and a principle of human beings, a society in which you were able to make that contribution. This is extremely important because we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the founding of our republic. And with the way our republic is conducting itself right now, you would wonder why anyone would want to celebrate that, because it's hideous, because we are acting as a criminal outlaw nation. And we should take this interval of time to reverse that, to find our identity. The second point I wanted to make in terms of this hyperinflation, and just for people to reflect, I don't have the answer to this question, but it's a very conscious policy when we impose sanctions, and Biden even said it outright about Russia when he called for Putin to be overthrown when he was in Poland. Why do we impose sanctions on people? Is it an accident that we want the population to be starving and not be able to get medicine and put and freezing to death in the winter? No, that's a deliberately done policy, because the theory is if you can torture the population and really make them suffer, instead of blaming the people imposing the sanctions and the hardship, they will blame their own government. And when they get all unhappy because they're starving and freezing to death and their infants are dying of curable diseases, that they will be so enraged that you can get them to overthrow their government. They'll be easily organized into an enraged mob, overthrow the government, and you can put a regime in place that you want. And part of what's going on here, I think you have to ask the question, because they can't be oblivious to the fact that if you double the price of gasoline and food, I mean, these are not things that people can do without and say, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. I really don't need food today. I don't really need food for the next 6 months, or gasoline. No, these are total necessities. By doing that, can you create the conditions where the population is in such an anxiety-filled, desperate, rage-filled condition that they can be manipulated so that you have the entire nation destroyed? You bring in some other form of government. I'm not saying that I know that's what it is, but you have to ask the question, since this is so deliberately done externally, would it really not be done internally? And therefore, the conference on June 18th and 19th is of critical importance, particularly for people in the United States, because the world depends, and our nation depends, on our making this shift back to the intention of our founders, which was to create a republic based on the principle of the consent of the governed, as Nicholas of Cusa conceived of it. If you say every human being is created in the image of God, then there is no human being, then we are all by nature equal. There's no one of us who is ordained to have ruling power over the rest of us. We grant that to people in whose judgment we trust in an act of free will. That was a revolutionary breakthrough. And the reason that you trust the person is, or group of people, is you trust that the principle of the general welfare and your right to become immortal will be protected. And this is what we urgently have to revive. And I think we can begin to get a glimmer of this again in a dialogue. Interestingly, these principles of the American Revolution are now being reflected back to us by the actions of President Putin, President Xi Jinping, Prime Minister Modi, in terms of the actions these nations are trying to take to prevent the worst catastrophes of famine and starvation, and to create the conditions where human beings on the planet live a better life. So that's what I'd like to contribute to this discussion right now.
Well, thank you for that, Diane. Let me just ask you before we go to questions. We have several questions already, but you had a meeting last night, and I think you were convened with a few other candidates for office. Could you tell us a little bit about what that was all about?
Yes, very lawfully. There is a growing, I would almost call it a movement. It's not huge, not thousands probably, but of maverick individuals with courage who've decided to take leadership. And so I have been reaching out to various independent or even party candidates who may not be welcomed in their parties to have a dialogue on these very urgent matters. So last night we had Paul Gallagher very ably giving us the overview, as he did today, in terms of the economy. And then we were joined by Joel DeJean, who is running for U.S. Congress as a LaRouche independent candidate in the 38th CD of Texas, Randy Perham, who is running for Congress in Alaska, the Republican candidate, and Jeff Young, who actually just won his Democratic primary, much to the dismay of certain Democratic Party hacks, campaigning very explicitly against the policy of arming Nazis in Ukraine. He also is a strong supporter of the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall and is very consciously aware of the Belt and Road Initiative and the strides China has taken to lift people out of poverty. And so this kind of dialogue, I think, is extremely important because we can create a leadership which is conscious of this process of collaboration. And imagine if we got a number of such people elected into the Congress, we might actually have a caucus of sane people who are not with the go with the flow candidates, shall I say.
Harley, let me go back to you for a minute and just ask, because you, of course, were emphasizing Diane's campaign in your own remarks. You're also over in Europe and have some sense of some of the other activity that's going on. I think, for example, in France, some of LaRouche's co-thinkers are talking to people who are running for office there. There's other things going on in Italy and so on. Just wanted to get both any response that you have to what Diane said already, or any other comments you'd like to make.
Well, I think it's important to note that what Diane did with her campaign is, in a sense, what we're seeing occurring in many parts of the world, which is people who are in opposition to this Anglo-American dictatorship, who are reaching out and finding allies. You know, in France, you have an interesting situation where they've tried to polarize it so that it was Macron versus the extreme right, Marine Le Pen in the general election. And now what's taking place tomorrow is the parliamentary election. And they're saying now it's Macron versus the far left Mélenchon. Now, in reality, at this point, the so-called left and the so-called right, I mean, there are differences in the approach, but the main difference is, or the main similarity, is the opposition to this authoritarianism of the establishment. Now, this is ironic because according to the Atlantic Council D10 initiative, which was part of the Summit for Democracy, you have two different kinds of governments in the world, democracies and authoritarian. But what Diane showed is that, in fact, the so-called democratic U.S. election process is not democratic. They tried to impose on every independent an onerous requirement of 45,000 signatures within a very short period of time, which is almost impossible to do. Well, Diane and her team did the impossible. And we're seeing something similar now occurring around different parts of the world, where people who are ordinarily not part of the political process are joining and are working to change their country. And we're seeing really interesting developments. For example, in the Philippines, where the new president is the son of Ferdinand Marcos, who was deposed in the middle 1980s in a regime change coup. But the people of the Philippines put Marcos's son back in the presidency. We're seeing López Obrador in Mexico, supposedly a leftist, but nevertheless standing up against the United States on the basis of principle. So I think the thing that's frustrating here in Europe is the media, as in the United States, is corrupt, but virtually every single institution is controlled. And so you see the political parties that are ending up in governments of candidates who get 25, 26, 27% of the vote. Macron in the first general election just got 27%. Olaf Scholz, who's now chancellor in Germany, got 26%. And so you have these coalitions of people who don't agree on anything except doing the bidding of Wall Street and London. So this is the moment for a real insurgency, much bigger than in 2016 when we saw Brexit and the Trump election. And for it to work, it does require a program. And what we've been talking about, myself and also especially Paul, is the LaRouche program, the 4 laws, and that's what Diane Serra is running on. So this is a real opportunity to restore this American system tradition as the driving force of global economic cooperation and development.
Okay, I have a question I'm going to direct to both you and to Diane. It's from Jeremiah, and here's what he asks. Do we really have a U.S. dollar today if we can't control our own currency or credit? And if so, how can we regain our sovereignty, and be a nation that is a true leader in the world for the good of humanity? So Harley, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Diane.
Well, I think it's interesting. This is something that Vladimir Putin took up just yesterday on this question of sovereignty. And what he essentially was discussing, and has been discussing in the last week or so, is the difference between the money printing in the United States, which has become the center of economic policy, versus the investment in the population and in science and technology and in productive enterprises in Russia. He made a very funny quip. He said the one thing we see from the United States is the productivity of the money printing presses, because what we're seeing is a huge increase in monetary aggregates, which is what's causing the inflation. Now, this is not an attribute of the dollar, and this is part of the problem. What Lyndon LaRouche always says is money is stupid. People who focus on money are focusing on the wrong thing. A dollar is a means of exchange. The question is, what's behind it? And I'm not simply talking about a gold standard or a gold reserve system. We're talking about, is there a real physical economy so that the money that's printed for the distribution of goods and the establishment of credit is backed by something real? Now, we had that during the period from 1945 until 1971. It was a gold reserve system. There were flaws in it because Roosevelt died and the British, through John Maynard Keynes and others, had an influence on that. But the system generally worked because the U.S. economy was growing, and because of what was done by Kennedy in particular with science and technology to move the United States to a productive economy. So, the question of the dollar is the question of physical economy. If you remove the physical side of things, if you look at LaRouche's triple curve, with financial aggregates going up to the sky and monetary aggregates going up as well, so that you can have liquidity to back up the financial aggregates, but then the production curve is collapsing. All you have is a flood of worthless money. And when in the beginning, when we saw Jamie Dimon talking about the problems of quantitative easing and quantitative tapering, what he's basically saying is that this is a monetary balancing act, and he's hoping that this will work. Well, it's not going to work. And that's why physical economy is the key. That's why Glass-Steagall is an essential feature. If we went back to the Glass-Steagall system of regulated banking, of no bailouts, of a credit system that was there for physical investment in physical production, we wouldn't have to worry about the dollar. And the dollar would be part of whatever monetary system you set up. Whether it would be a dollar system or not is not the question. The Russians are talking about using all different currencies for international transactions. But if you have an agreement that these will be representative of a commitment to investment in physical economy, then whatever the money you use isn't the problem. if you use the dollar based on the military strength of the United States to force you to knuckle under to U.S. policies, then you're going to be hastening the collapse of the dollar system.
Yeah, Diane, just before you say respond, I'd like to read something from Putin from St. Petersburg. This is where he was talking. He said, speaking to a group of young people, he said, "We live in an era of change. This is obvious to everyone. Everyone understands and sees this. Geopolitical, scientific, and technological transformations are happening. The world is changing, and it is doing so rapidly. In order to claim some kind of leadership, I am not even talking about global leadership. I mean leadership in any area. Any country, any people, any ethnic group should ensure their sovereignty, because there is no in-between, no intermediate state. Either a country is sovereign or it is a colony, no matter what the colonies are called. If a country or a group of countries is not able to make sovereign decisions, then it is already a colony to a certain extent. But a colony has no historical prospects, no chance for survival in this tough geopolitical struggle, so forth and so on." He goes on. So these were just remarks from the past approximately 36 hours. So again, what's your comment on the question that we got from Jeremiah?
Well, two. One is, if we continue at the rate we're going, we won't have to worry, because the dollar will just blow itself out and it'll go the way of the Reichsmark, and people will have $1 million notes that they show their grandchildren that were used for wallpaper or something. But also, what Harley said, I just would echo. I mean, this Glass-Steagall is crucial, and also critically, you have to have this conference where we get rid of floating exchange rates. We have to take this speculative bubble out of this process. So whatever these currencies are pegged to, you want a constant relationship among the currencies, which allows you to actually plan for the long term. And that's what would give the dollar or any currency its strength. It's not what you can quote unquote buy from it or what its purchasing power is at the moment, but that it represents something also in the future. And all of the best leaders of the United States, going back to Ben Franklin, who wrote about paper currency, Hamilton was the most clear in the Revolutionary period, and then Lyndon LaRouche, who really was the greatest insight and breakthroughs on this principle of physical economy, insisted the dollar, the money, the currency, there is no intrinsic value. It in and of itself has no value. It is only an instrument to create a directionality which allows the human species not only to reproduce itself, but to reproduce itself in a way which the next generation is superior to the previous. Longer life expectancy, better educated, consumes more energy, and has more people able to live comfortably in a given land area, because we have become that much more powerful over nature. And that would, if the dollar were the instrument to do that for this country in concert with other nations, then it would have a relationship to the United States again and not be a British dollar or a petrodollar or drug dollar or any of the other things that have become lately.
Okay, there's a discussion going on in the chat room that I should inform both of you of. And one person, Kevin, brings up that Glass-Steagall would never happen under capitalism. So I think that might give us an opportunity to say something, since, in fact, Glass-Steagall did happen under capitalism. But Harley, why don't you take that up, and let's discuss why it's thinkable that somebody would say that, given the way in which people might understand the present United States as being capitalist, which is itself disputable.
Well, forget the term capitalism for a moment. Glass-Steagall came in when the financial system collapsed, but it didn't come in right away. You had a stock market collapse in 1929 that was preceded by 3 years of economic uncertainty, economic decline, and when Franklin Roosevelt was elected, the banks started collapsing. Now, it was at that point that the climate was there where there was a decision that could be made to move against the power of these universal banks. And that was the context in which Glass-Steagall was brought in. Some people say, well, it was done to save capitalism. No, it was done to save the American people and the American economy. The bankers at that time were exposed by Ferdinand Pecora and the Pecora Commission as a bunch of swindlers who were using their power of money to decide who could get electricity, who could have food, who could borrow money. It's not very different from what's happening today, only now you have the green factor added in. Now, the question is not capitalism versus socialism or left versus right. It's physical economy. That in order for a nation to thrive, you need to have several components. One is a workforce that is improving its standard of living, and that's improving its educational level. But you also need a credit policy which ensures that as there are new discoveries made, scientific discoveries, technological discoveries, that companies can get credit to bring those in online. Now, one of the problems that we're seeing is that in the recent years, there's no money, as Paul was showing, the banks are not making loans. They are making loans to speculators, but not to producers. And this is where you see what the problem is. And so I think the important point here is that in a moment of crisis, what seemed impossible changes. And let me quote someone I usually don't quote on this, but I'll quote former President Obama. When he first came in, he had a meeting with some of the leading bankers. And the question was, would he follow up the Bush-Hank Paulson plan for a bailout of the collapsing investment banking system, or would he go against it? And what Obama said is, I'm the one standing between you and the pitchforks. So it was clear that he was going to defend the bankers and sell the policy to the population as in their interests. Well, what does that show? It shows that he knew that the population was riled up and could have been organized to support Glass-Steagall. That was LaRouche's policy from 2007 to 2010, during this time when it would have been possible. You could have had an alliance between the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street to push this through. But there was not a leadership other than LaRouche that would do it. That's why we have to do that today. And by we, I mean we have, in the case of Diane, a very prominent campaign in the center of the financial district to put this forward. But we need in every part of the country people who will speak up for this and go out and educate people on it. The biggest problem we have is people thinking it can't happen. I think it's going to happen, provided enough of you get out there and do the mobilization without thinking of it in terms of the existing axioms of economics, but educate yourself to understand what LaRouche's triple curve demonstrates about the interrelationship between finance, money, and production.
Okay, I have a question that's for you, Harla, directed to you. And Diane, you're also probably going to want to answer this. And then after that, I want to have not a digression, but a particular discussion about this issue of the electoral process. Couple of observations there we need to discuss. Anyway, the question's from Jose, and the question is the following. The legislative body of El Salvador has approved the construction of a Pacific rail line to connect one end of El Salvador to another. Since El Salvador is a tiny country, the government has expressed optimism and hope that the rail could connect Guatemala, and Honduras, and extend the existing train line to Mexico. This would mean you could have a line that goes from Mexico to the end of El Salvador. What exactly would that mean for the rules-based order? Is this an example of creative nonviolence? And if so, is the way that countries around the world could rebel against evil oligarchy, would a way to do that be by developing big projects like rail and hospital construction?
Well, that's a simple answer on one level, which is that this is what the oligarchy has tried to prevent for the last couple centuries. This is what colonialism was about. Colonialism is you build the rail systems from the raw materials to the ports so that you can use the cheap labor to harvest the food or to dig up the minerals in the earth, ship them by rail to the port, and then have them sail to the mother country to be developed. Now, this was the big fight at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century. Would there be the connection by rail that would allow corridors of development to link up countries that otherwise were isolated and under control of colonies? You know, if you take the example that Jose is doing of El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, why wouldn't there be railroads high-speed railroads connecting these countries? It's an obvious solution to give these countries the interconnectedness, including to ports on both sides in the Caribbean on one and the Pacific on the other side. Why not? Well, that's the nature of imperialism, the nature of colonialism. And after the colonies were independent, they couldn't get credit to build these rail systems. Look at Africa. Why is it that the major cities of Africa are not connected by rail from the north to the south, from the east to the west? This discussion of Central America, the same thing's going on now in South America. Who's interested actually right now in funding the rail systems that will connect these countries? It's the Chinese. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is in discussions with a number of these countries. So you have Vice President Harris talking to Hondurans and the governments of Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and others, telling them, we're going to help you. We're going to help you build solar panels. We're going to help you with the technologies that will never allow you to produce the value, the physical value that will allow you to escape poverty. And the Chinese are saying, look what we've done with our system. So this is a perfect case of the difference between the 21st century capability exemplified by the Belt and Road Initiative and the 19th century mentality, which says we've got to keep these countries separate and fighting and as sources for wealth and cheap labor for the mother countries. And that's what the fight is all about. Now, the question is, why are there so many people who are spokesmen for the 19th century? And that's where you see the power of the corporate cartels in controlling the whole discussion about economics and turning it into a discussion about money. That isn't it better to make money now by speculation than sinking a large amount of money into production where there may already be so-called overproduction? You know, these are false narratives. Science and technology will produce new degrees of capabilities for an expanded rate of growth, which is the way you get out of poverty, as the Chinese have demonstrated in the last 20 years.
And as I refer this question to you, let me also add in that there's been some other discussion about the fact that this area of the world in particular has been a center of the drug trade and of various forms of violence. And so when it's part of the question is the way the countries around the world should rebel against the evil oligarchs of the world by developing big projects like rail and hospital construction. I just wanted to make sure I added that in.
Well, that's important because that was one of the issues that came up One of these, I think it was the president of Honduras, didn't come to the Summit of the Americas because he's under attack by the State Department because they say he's violating human rights with his anti-drug campaign.
Yeah. Diane, any thoughts on this?
Only that refusing to drop dead when you're ordered to, I suppose, might be an act of creative nonviolence. So I would say yes, in a sense. That is in part what this is.
Okay. Yeah, so what I want to do is for a moment, let me just check. There was one other question, I believe, but I may hold it at the moment. And there are various people who are just otherwise congratulating Diane on the fact that she successfully collected the signatures and is now a candidate, independent candidate for the United States Senate. So next week's conference, we've talked about this idea of what Helga Zepp LaRouche has begun calling Mission Impossible. It was a discussion we had earlier today. Some persons were involved. I was involved in it, in which the idea of being able to compose a grouping in the United States, diverse grouping, that would very clearly state that the notion of national sovereignty for all nations, and particularly a collaboration with Russia, China, India, and other nations for the purpose of fighting, as has been proposed by Xi Jinping, for example, with respect to a global economic initiative, global health initiative, global security initiative, to fight for the right of people, not merely to grow and develop, but more importantly, to actually make this process of the sanctions and of thermonuclear war, that this has got to become obsolete. So there is an issue that constantly has come up, and it came up in that discussion, which is that we have to confront the American people with the fact that people all over the world just don't believe it's possible that there's anybody in America that will really fight against the present policies that are coming out of the City of London and Wall Street, but also are, at least by silence, apparently supported by the American people. And so this led to sort of a process of discussion, but everybody here, Harley, you over decades, and Diane now both as a candidate, and even from the early days of her first association with the presidential campaign of Lyndon LaRouche, these are questions that we've had to discuss and we've had to think about. So the notion is we have a lot of people in the United States who have been involved with or know Lyndon LaRouche or have seen what we've done over decades. And now we have a kind of critical moment where we have to do something about this danger. And so the question is, what's the relationship between activating people in what people have often referred to as the electoral arena, or the legislative arena for that matter, but activating them with the small window of opportunity that we seem to have at this point to reverse the circumstance that we're in. So Harley, let me start with you first and then go to Diane, and let's see what she has to say as well.
Well, I would say one of the biggest problems you have with that is the psychological warfare that's run by the people who control the process, which is the use of such things as identity politics to put people into smaller fights which they think are winnable, but are against people who could be their allies. And so one of the problems you have is that people get intensely passionate about smaller and smaller parts of the problem and put forward solutions which aren't solutions. For example, America First. The America First as a slogan and what at times was meant by President Trump may have been okay, but what it missed is the ability to link up with other countries that had similar interests, similar concerns, and would wish to be allied with the United States to overcome the power of London and the people running the psychological warfare. So I think the first thing you have to do is get people to, at least a leadership grouping, to recognize that we have to fight for the whole enchilada, the big picture, not get caught up in some of the smaller fights that might seem winnable, but which don't lead anywhere. And once you do that, then you've got to be constantly persistent at staying ahead of the media, ahead of the narratives, with an educational process to bring people up to the understanding of what is the American system. You know, right now there's very little hope after the 2020 election. Many people are despairing that you can't have a fair election. Well, the really important thing is to organize enough people that you have a landslide. And that means you have to have a program. And that's why what we're doing with our conferences is to give people an understanding of what the real issues are and how you win this fight globally and in the United States. Because if people have that conception, the hunger is there for change. But change for what? Change to what? That's what we have to concentrate our efforts on. And I think that's something that is exactly what Diane has done in the way she ran the campaign to get on the ballot.
Yeah, Diane, one person congratulates you on standing up against the 7 Ways to Sunday citizen traitor, Chuck Schumer. So I thought I probably should convey that. But if you have any thoughts about this process.
Yeah, I think one of the good things about the electoral process is that people like the idea that Americans can disagree with each other and still be Americans and still love our nation and still implicitly love one another. We don't see much of that now. As Harley said, if you try and turn it into these stupid little issues that actually don't mean anything in the context of facing thermonuclear war and mass starvation and no energy, you can get people very, very emotional and hysterically screaming at each other over nothing. But on the other hand, it is an opportunity where people feel like they are supposed to be involved. They do have to talk to their friends. That was one of the big challenges about the petitioning. Just to give one report, this is from someone who ended up not getting many signatures. They sent in a handful of signatures and instead gave a financial donation saying, you know, I have to thank you because I have a whole new insight about myself. I had this idea that I was going to go to all of my various jobs and talk to people about signing the petition to put you on the ballot, and I discovered that I was unable to do it. I just felt too inhibited, that there were other things going on with work, that it would have been an imposition. I couldn't bring myself to do it, and I didn't really realize what was involved in this. So that was one response, which is frankly an interesting response. You might say it would have been better had the person figured out how to overcome it, but everyone won't. Everybody has different talents to bring in the process. Another person said, wow, I can't believe how good I am at doing this. I love talking to people. I know how to, and then most people were somewhere in between where they discovered they could have a certain effectiveness, but they had to become self-conscious of certain aspects about themselves to be involved in that. And I thought this really was beautiful because, you know, unfortunately, we've had the lockdowns for 2 years, the social distancing, the isolation, combined with the development of the so-called social media, which really should be called the asocial media. And we've lost one of the most important aspects of society, which is the ability of one of us to communicate with another one. So part of the beauty of restoring a sane electoral process would be to restore this ability of people to communicate an idea, to have a disagreement, and to come even to a higher understanding to resolve the paradox which seems to divide you, although you may have the same goal. And I'll give one example. Is there anybody who really thinks it's good for teenagers to run into schools and shoot dozens of other people? I would submit that whether you're Republican or Democrat, pro for the Second Amendment, anti-Second Amendment, whatever, everyone agrees that this is not a good thing. And that perhaps we should figure out a way to prevent this. And it's not going to be as simple as making a law against guns, either having more guns or less guns. Perhaps it's not the guns that have something to do with this, but something else. And if by having a discussion, knowing that both sides urgently want to have a situation where it is safe to send your children to school, and what is going on in that school, and perhaps it's better not to be talking about sex, but how to replicate thermonuclear fusion or something else, we might have some very, very productive discussions where people are not coming at it from the same standpoint, but actually realize that we are all passionately committed to solving this problem. And I think having an electoral season, if you will, or an election gives us an opportunity to do that. And I think that's why also the controllers of this feel so they don't want that. They want to limit on the ballot. They want to limit who can be in a debate. They don't want anything in the media. They want to ban people from even saying certain things or raising a question about whether an election was fair or not. You're not allowed to discuss it. You're not allowed to ask questions. They're very, very threatened by the kind of dialogue process that would take place among a citizenry that's really concerned to solve problems.
Okay, I'm going to take something up. There's a question that we got, and but I'm actually going to set this question up. It's a question concerning, Diane, your involvement both in music and in general, emphasizing in your campaign your role as a musician. But to set this up, I want to reference the article that was written by Ellen Taylor, the daughter of Telford Taylor, one of the prosecutors at Nuremberg. And in her article, what she does is that she criticizes various writers, including Naomi Klein, for saying that what Putin was doing and what Russia was doing was trying to reconquer Ukraine because they have a sense of what was called by Klein toxic nostalgia. So Ellen Taylor responds to that by saying, nostalgia notwithstanding, Russia did not resist Ukraine's bid for independence in 1991, nor did it interfere with the illegal coup of 2014. It did take the critically protective step of reclaiming its naval base in Sevastopol and liberating Khrushchev's gift to Ukraine, Russian Crimea. And then she goes on and makes the following point. She says, students of Russian history, culture, and literature begin their educational journey with immersion in the life and events of Rus, what is now Ukraine. The Russian Orthodox Church had its origins in Ukraine. The action of Russia's great epic poem, The Song of Igor's Campaign, occurs in present-day Ukraine. She compares that poem to Gilgamesh and the French Song of Roland. Many of Russia's and the world's favorite authors are Ukrainian. Nikolai Gogol, Mikhail Sholokhov, Mikhail Bulgakov, Isaac Babel. I should mention also Sholem Aleichem. Ukrainians are extensively intermarried with Russians and statesmen among them. Leonid Brezhnev was Ukrainian. Khrushchev had a Ukrainian wife and was raised in Ukraine. Dmitry Medvedev's wife is Ukrainian. Although there were separatist revolts after World War II in Ukraine, mainly instigated by Western Ukrainians who had fought with the Nazis. The fact that Khrushchev gave Crimea, home of the Russian Navy for almost 250 years, to Ukraine in 1954 is evidence that he had not the slightest doubt of its intimate relationship with Russia. So the conference will be taking up in panel 4 the issue of the relationship between culture and the idea of culture, which is very much under assault. In fact, there's one Ukrainian official who's talking about burning something like 1 million books of Russian literature there now. And so the real issue, the question was, you talked about being a musician and a conductor during your campaign. Why? And why was that so important? And why is that so important or central to both your identity and the process of your campaign? So let's start with you, Diane, and then Harley, you may have some things to add as well.
Well, it's interesting. It's sort of hard to think about how to discuss this, actually. You know, I'm thinking of, because I'm thinking about this Russia question, the chorus in St. Petersburg when Beethoven was composing the Missa Solemnis. And apparently there had been a great project going back, I guess, a century or so prior to that, of the great Italian bel canto teachers visiting Russia. There was a great exchange of bel canto technique and discussion, and this chorus in St. Petersburg may have even been the best chorus in the world at the time, because anyone who begins to study the Missa Solemnis, as the Schiller Institute NYC chorus did, discovers that it is actually fiendishly difficult, very, very challenging for the voice. The range is extreme, and you realize that, and I think it might be partly why the ugly lie about Beethoven, that he didn't understand the voice or wasn't writing for the voice, came into existence, in part because an amateur chorus of today, looking at this, which is really impossible, the bass part should be split between 3 different voices, a basso profundo, a bass baritone, and then a tenor. You can't possibly have all of these parts in one voice. Similarly with the soprano and every other. Actually, it was done, and there were letters between Beethoven and his commissioner, I guess, patron, where they were discussing the fact that this music that he was writing could only really be performed in St. Petersburg, or be performed best by this chorus. Now that is really fascinating. Also, I would say, when you hear great music, or you hear this, a lot of people may know the words of the Latin Mass, so there's a certain universal principle to knowing the words. But I would submit, even if you don't know the words, that you're able to have a conception of what the music is bringing about. And I think perhaps that is the power. If you have classical composition based on universal physical principles, which are the same principles by which creative reason works in every human being's mind, then you recognize that there is universality among us and the creator of the universe, which is above words or any of these lower level considerations. And there's also a very profound joy in that. And you can't listen to a Beethoven symphony without hearing a quality of victory. You hear the paradoxes. I say here, which is a terrible thing, because it's really not in the quote unquote sound, it's in the conception of it. But your mind recreates a certain conception, and you are able to apprehend the possibility of a solution to something that seemed unresolvable. I would also say that Helen Keller famously, quote unquote, listened to Beethoven and also great singers and was able, just from the sense of touch, not what we think of in terms of tone, but what she was able to gather was in a completely different way, with completely different quote-unquote senses than what we're used to listening to, whether a performance was musical and poetic and whether it was not. So those are all aspects that go into this question.
I think that was Prince Galitzin, I believe, that sponsored it in St. Petersburg. But Harley?
Yes.
Any thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah, just a short one, a reference back to someone you mentioned, Sholem Aleichem. You know, what's important about culture is its universal nature, what Diane just touched on. But that a beautiful composition, whether it's a painting, a symphony, a poem, a tragic drama, it touches the part of all of us which is truly human. You know, that it reaches through the senses and the immediate fears and gives you something above that to show you that there is something that we all have in common. And, you know, I often refer to Sholem Aleichem, who was a Ukrainian Jew, one of the most prominent of the Yiddish humorists and authors. But he wasn't just a humorist. He was actually organizing a population which had suffered from the pogroms, the anti-Semitism, which was both Russian and in Ukraine, and yet was trying to bring to his readers this sense of the higher qualities, how there could be understanding between people of different cultures. And he has this one story where some village Jews are sitting around talking about how terrible it is with the pogroms and everything else. And one of them decides to change the subject to something lighter. And he says, any news about the cholera epidemic in Odessa? And, you know, when you read that, you're struck by this is something that is intended to give people a higher sense of what our lives are about. And that's what real leaders do. That's one thing that you saw from Lyndon LaRouche. It's something you see from Abraham Lincoln. When you read the works of Franklin, when you look at the scientific works of Kepler, of Leibniz, there's always these qualities that include a surprise, an irony that forces you to think back on what you think you already know and think about it from a different standpoint. And I think that's why one of the aspects of fascism is to attack great universal culture, either by rejecting it because it's not from your nation or just rejecting it as culture per se. So I think that's why it's important that our campaigns always incorporate these higher qualities of what it is that makes us human.
Okay, so that's basically where I think we're going to leave it today from the standpoint of the questions and so forth. Just want to see if there's any final words, Harley, you would have, and then we'll go to Diane for a final conclusion as well.
Final words. Go to the schillerinstitute.com and register for the conference on the 18th and 19th. And someone wrote me an email and said, why do you want people to register? Well, one thing is we want to know who's signing up. But we also want people to not just register, but to register others, become a mover and a shaker, part of the movement. And by registering, the other thing is that you'll get a notification. So in case you forget it, because of everything else going on in your life, you'll be reminded. But the registration process is important because we need to bring more people into this discussion so that the United States is not left out, because the rest of the world is moving in a different direction. The transatlantic is moving down the toilet, and that has to change, and it's up to us to do it.
Okay, thank you. Diane?
I think Harley is right. People should register for the June 18th and 19th conference. And I would add don't underestimate what you are capable of personally affecting. We should not expect that the enemies of civilization are going to broadcast to us when we are on the brink of breaking through their broken, shattered system, including their brainwashing. And I think this is a fight that can be won, and we can see some other amazing breakthroughs, but it does require not throwing in the towel.
All right. So Diane Sayre, Harley Schlanger, I want to thank you for being with us today. Also thank Paul Gallagher for the presentation and autopsy report he gave us on the train wreck of J.B. Diamond's presentation. And now I just want to thank everybody also for being with us today. Say a few final words about the conference that's coming up. One of the things that's under discussion, and Harley referred to this already several times, is that different heads of state and different prominent individuals, whether they be from Ghana or from Guyana, from India, from China, from Russia, are all discussing this issue of sovereignty. There's a culture of sovereignty that was established by the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution, and that was exported around the world to some degree, although the final actual actions to do that have never really come together. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, intended that after the conclusion of the Second World War, but he died and was unable to do that himself. When Lyndon LaRouche, as a young veteran, made his commitment to take up what Franklin Roosevelt and others like him had left off, what he did was he went out and he created, over time, an organization of people to do that. And it wasn't funded by Project Democracy. It wasn't funded by the CIA or OSS or things like that. It didn't work that way. A lot of people wanted to claim that because it was an easy way for them to explain to themselves why they weren't doing what they knew they should do. Somewhat like Martin Luther King in a different way, who did something which was different. After all, King was fundamentally a Baptist preacher, but he was actually a Christian, which is what differentiated him from a lot of other Baptist preachers and other preachers. Therefore, he understood what his probable self-sacrifice would have to be, not meaning his assassination, but meaning the idea of what's sometimes referred to as the mortification of the flesh. People would argue, well, that's not what King was about because of the affairs and this and that. No, the actual idea was that when you not just give your body to be burned, but you place your reputation and your career and all these other things at the disposal, not merely of the cause, but of the idea that this cause is for all of humanity. It may focus on a particular group of people. It may start with a particular group of people, but that's only an accident. The substance of the cause is the changing of humanity as a whole. Right now, we are able, because of the various forms of electronic communications and so on, to pretty much talk to anyone around the globe at any time. They speak different languages, we all speak different languages and so on, but there is a way in which at least the capability of addressing ourselves to everyone on the planet simultaneously exists now for the first time in human history, with a kind of convenience that allows anyone to be able to do it. And therefore, that means that the right ideas, the profound and impassioned conceptions that change man and change nature, this is the substance of what is the true dialogue among humanity, and a culture of sovereignty can be established by that means. That is to say, whether we're talking about physical economic development, we're talking about the application of scientific discoveries and inventions, or we're talking about the extension of healthcare to all people, simply because that's a human right, or should be a human right. These are things that are within the grasp of individual human beings that are endowed by their creator with the unalienable right to immortality. That is to say, the unalienable right to pursue precisely the happiness of the human race as a whole, and in that sense, that expression of life in the universe. The conference that we're holding, that the Schiller Institute is holding on June 18th and 19th, is intended to convoke in the people that participate in it the idea of the responsibility, not merely the right. Yes, you have an unalienable right, but you also have an unalienable responsibility, both to yourself and to posterity. But then again, people have a choice as to whether or not they're going to take that. That's free will. So you have to volunteer, if you will, for that choice. It can't be foisted upon you. Citizenship or other such things, these things are not simple rights. These are actually, in one sense, they're noble vocations to be taken up. And so what we would hope you would gain from some appreciation of what has happened in the Diane Sare Senate campaign, or what is happening by the remarks of various leaders from around the world, or what you may have gleaned from Linda LaRouche's remarks from now over a decade, about a decade ago. You and I have our responsibility. This is our job to change things, not a politician's, not some administrators, not some foundations. And it's this to which we would like to recruit you and have you choose to act on behalf of humanity as a whole. And so we want to urge you to attend that conference that will be happening next week, all day, starting at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, Eastern Daylight Time. And it will be the same on Sunday, 2 panels, and will be keynoted by Helga Zepp LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute. So on behalf of the Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche Organization, we want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we'll see you hopefully next week at the Schiller Conference.